Everyone knows George Harrison as the quiet Beatle, the spiritual one, the calm in the storm of Lennon and McCartney's creative whirlwind. He was the soulful anchor in the world's biggest band, the guy who looked eastward for answers while the rest of the world looked at them. We saw the gentle smile, the patient demeanor, the quiet wisdom. But what if that quietness wasn't always peace? What if, for decades, it was masking a deep-seated frustration, privately directed at one man? This is the story of how Paul McCartney, his supposed big brother, and George Harrison became locked in a rivalry that festered for years. It's a story of a grudge that nearly lasted a lifetime and a battle of wills that helped break the Beatles. All seen through the eyes of the man who felt overshadowed by it all. To understand the decades of resentment, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a double-decker bus rattling through the streets of Liverpool. This is where the story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney really begins. They met as schoolboys at the prestigious Liverpool Institute. Paul, a year older, was already confident and charismatic. George was younger, quieter, but had the same burning passion for the new, electrifying sound of rock and roll. They bonded over skiffle music and guitars. Paul McCartney remembered how their friendship grew on that half-hour bus ride to school, where they'd talk about guitars and teach each other chords. It was an innocent time. They were just two kids dreaming of a world bigger than the post-war gloom of their city. Paul even recalled hitchhiking with George to Wales for an adventure, their guitars as their only companions. It was a pure friendship, forged in youthful hope. Paul was the one who opened the door for George. He was already in a band, the Quarrymen, with an older, formidable teddy boy named John Lennon. Paul saw the raw talent in his younger friend and pushed for him. Lennon was skeptical at first. George, having just turned 15, seemed too young, too baby-faced. But Paul insisted, setting up a second meeting on the upper deck of a bus where George flawlessly ripped through the complex instrumental. Raunchy, that sealed it. Lennon was convinced. George was in, right from the start, though the dynamic was set. George was the little brother, brought into the fold by Paul. He was the junior member, looking up to the established partnership of John and Paul. Even McCartney himself would later admit to this imbalance. In a candid reflection years later, Paul said, "I tended to talk down to him because he was a year younger. I know now that that was a failing I had all the way through the Beatle years." If you've known a guy when he's 13 and you're 14, it's hard to think of him as grown up. This seemingly small age difference would cast a very long shadow. It created a hierarchy that, in the early days, felt natural. But as the Beatles' phenomenon exploded, this big brother-little brother dynamic would become the source of a deep and lasting wound. George owed his spot in the band to Paul, a fact that would color their interactions for the rest of their lives. He was grateful, but he was also perpetually in his friend's shadow. In George's mind, it felt like a debt that Paul would never quite let him forget. The seeds of conflict were sown right there, on that school bus, long before the world even knew their names. When Beatlemania hit, the world saw four inseparable friends who conquered the globe. They were a unit, a gang, a force of nature. And in those early, dizzying days of touring, they were incredibly close, sharing hotel rooms, inside jokes, and an experience no one else on Earth could possibly understand. But beneath the surface of this united front, the old schoolyard hierarchy was hardening into a professional one. The engine of the Beatles was, without question, the songwriting partnership of Lennon and McCartney. They were brilliant, prolific, and commercially unstoppable. George was the lead guitarist, a crucial role that gave the band its sound, but creatively, he was often on the outside looking in. His own efforts at songwriting, which began to emerge as he grew in confidence, were frequently met with indifference or pushed to the back of the line. Harrison himself would later talk about the immense frustration he felt. He had a growing backlog of songs, but the band's schedule was dictated by the Lennon-McCartney machine. Before one of his own compositions could even be considered, they had to work through a mountain of John and Paul's material. It wasn't necessarily malicious, but it was the reality of the band's momentum. John and Paul had been writing together for years. George was trying to break into a conversation that was already well underway. Bob Dylan, a friend and admirer of Harrison's, put it perfectly. George got stuck with being the beetle that had to fight to get songs on records because of Lennon. And McCartney, well, who wouldn't get stuck? The fight was constant. He wasn't just competing for a spot on an album. He was competing against one of the greatest songwriting duos in history. The patronizing attitude Paul admitted to from their school days carried over into the studio. As the band's unofficial musical director, especially in the later years, McCartney's vision for a song was paramount. This often extended to George's guitar parts. George, a guitarist of immense taste, found his ideas frequently overruled. There's the famous example during the recording of Hey Jude, where Harrison wanted to play a guitar riff that answered each of Paul's vocal lines. Paul flatly rejected it. For Paul, it was about protecting his song. For George, it was another. Painful reminder of his status. It was insulting. Pattie Boyd, Harrison's wife at the time, saw the toll it took on him. She described him as terribly unhappy during this period. The Beatles made him unhappy with the constant arguments, she recalled. They were vicious to each other. He was pushed into the background. He would come home from recording and be full of anger. This anger wasn't just about music. It was about respect. George was growing as an artist and as a man, yet he felt he was still being treated like the kid on the bus. The world saw him as an equal quarter of the Fab Four, but in the studio he was often made to feel like his job was to serve the vision of Lennon and McCartney. The quietness the world saw was, in reality, a stifled voice. When the Beatles stopped touring in 1966, the studio became their new universe. This shift should have been George Harrison's liberation. It was a chance to finally flex his creative muscles and explore the new sounds and spiritual ideas that were consuming him. And for a little while it seemed to be working on albums like Revolver and SGT, Peppers. Harrison's contributions became more distinct and ambitious. He introduced the sitar and Indian music to the West, writing groundbreaking tracks like Love You Too and The Beautiful Within You Without You. He was no longer just the lead guitarist. He was a sonic pioneer. He was finding his voice. And it sounded unlike anything else in music, but finding his voice and getting it heard were two different things. While his songs were making it onto the albums, the struggle for space was still immense. For every taxman that made the cut, countless other ideas were brushed aside. The Lennon-McCartney factory was still at full capacity, and the unofficial quota for George often felt more like a concession than a sign of respect. He once said that getting a song recorded by the Beatles was like going through a big obstacle. Course, this all came to a head during the sessions for the White Album. In 1968, George had written a song he knew was special, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. It was a masterpiece, a haunting reflection on the unspoken tensions within his own band. When he first played it for the others, their reaction was lukewarm. According to George, they didn't take it seriously. Dejected, he went home that night, thinking what a shame it was. The next day, he decided to do something about it. On his way to the studio, he called his friend, Eric Clapton. He invited Clapton to come play on the track. Clapton was hesitant, saying, "Oh no, I can't do that. Nobody ever plays on Beatles records." George simply replied, "Look, it's my song and I want you to play on it." When Clapton walked into Abbey Road, the atmosphere changed instantly. Suddenly, John, Paul, and Ringo were on their best behavior. They were attentive, professional, and gave the song the respect it deserved. Clapton's presence had validated George in a way his own bandmates wouldn't. He had to bring in an outsider just to get his own band to listen. The resulting track was iconic, but the victory was bittersweet. This experience, and others like it, chipped away at him. He later spoke about the effect Paul's dominance had on his confidence, explaining that Paul's tendency to dictate his solos was like a confidence crippler. Being constantly overruled by a man he once looked up to as a big brother took a psychological toll. The quiet one had found his voice, but he was getting tired of having to shout to be heard. The year 1968 was a paradox for the Beatles. It was a year of immense creativity, but it was also the year the cracks in their foundation started to show. The catalyst for a lot of this was a trip to Rishikesh, India, to study transcendental meditation. For George, this journey was the peak of his spiritual quest. For the band, it mostly highlighted how much they were drifting apart. In the calm of the ashram, songs poured out of them, but they were writing separately. When they returned to London to record what would become the White Album, they brought that separateness with them. The album is often described as the work of 4 solo artists who just happened to be in the same building. So while the White Album is a monument to George's flowering as a major songwriter, making it was a deeply scarring process. The album's sprawling nature was a mirror of the band itself. They were together but no longer a unit. The stage was set for the final ugly confrontation, January 1969. The Beatles gathered at the cold, cavernous Twickenham film studios for a new project. Paul's idea was to get back to their roots, rehearse new material for a TV special, all captured on film. It was meant to be a fresh start. Instead, as George Harisson would later say, it was a worst-case scenario. The atmosphere was toxic. The cameras captured every sour look and passive-aggressive comment. John Lennon was often withdrawn, communicating more through Yoko Ono than with his bandmates. And Paul, as the project's leader, became, in George's eyes, a relentless taskmaster. The tension between them was about to explode for the world to see. It culminated in an infamous on-camera argument. As they rehearsed Two of Us, Paul began to micromanage George's guitar part. George, his patience gone, finally snapped. With years of frustration in his voice, he told Paul, "I'll play, whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was a moment of complete surrender, but it was also a declaration that he was done. The final straw came on January 10, 1969. After another tense exchange with Paul, George had had enough. He calmly packed up his guitar, turned to the others, and said, "I'm leaving the band now." As he walked out the door, he added a sarcastic, "See you around the clubs?" In his diary, he wrote, "Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home." That feeling of frustration and anger became the direct inspiration for a new song he would later write for his first solo album. He called it wah-wah. A wah was a guitar pedal, but George meant it as a headache. The fighting, the arguments, the creative suffocation, it had given him a wah-wah. The lyrics are a direct expression of his feelings. You've given me a wah, and I'm thinking of you and all the things that we used to do. It was a rejection of the pain of being a Beatle, a situation he felt was largely driven by Paul's overbearing presence. A few days later, after a meeting, George agreed to return, but only if they abandoned the TV special and moved to their own studio. He came back, and they finished the project, which led to the legendary rooftop concert. But something was broken for good. George had quit the biggest band in the world because the personal cost was too high. The Get Back sessions were supposed to bring the Beatles together. Instead, they sealed their fate and cemented a resentment. In George Harisson that would last for decades, the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, but the conflict was far from over. For George Harisson, the end of the band meant his long simmering resentment towards Paul McCartney came pouring out. The first battleground was the courtroom. To free himself from manager Alan Klein, Paul McCartney sued his former bandmates on December 31, 1970, to formally dissolve the partnership. For Paul, it was a necessary evil. For George, it was the ultimate betrayal. He channeled this bitterness directly into his music. On his 1973 album Living in the Material World, he included a scathing track called Sue Me, Sue You Blues. Over a rollicking slide guitar, he sings, "Well, you serve me, and I'll serve you / swing your partners, all get screwed." It was a direct jab at Paul's lawsuit, but George wasn't just fighting his own battles. He firmly aligned himself with John Lennon, who had his own deep-seated issues with Paul. This alliance was cemented when George played the searing slide guitar on John's infamous 1971 track, How Do You Sleep? The song was a vicious, personal attack on Paul with lines like, "The only thing you done was yesterday." And there, right alongside him, was George, his guitar weeping not gently, but with venom. His participation was a powerful statement. Years later, George would say he was just helping a friend, and that the tense feelings were directed at the situation. But the message at the time was clear. Ringo Starr, who was also at the sessions, was reportedly so uncomfortable he told John, "That's enough." But George stayed. He played Dot throughout the 70s, the frostiness remained. In interviews, George often took swipes at Paul, referring to his music as granny music. "I'd join a band with John Lennon any day," he said in one press conference. "But I couldn't join a band with Paul McCartney. It's nothing personal, it's just from a musical point of view." But of course, it was personal. It was about years of feeling patronized and having his music dismissed. The breakup didn't heal these wounds. It ripped them wide open. While Paul was moving on with Wings, George released All Things Must Pass, a triple-album masterpiece filled with songs the Beatles had rejected. It was a monumental success and his ultimate vindication. It was proof that the quiet Beatle had a voice that demanded to be heard. But even in that triumph, the shadow of the feud loomed large. As the 70s gave way to the 80s, the public animosity between George and Paul began to soften, replaced by a wary distance. They were no longer actively feuding, but they weren't exactly friends. For about 10 years after the split, their contact was rare and often strained. The tragic murder of John Lennon in December 1980 was a shock that forced a recalibration. Shortly after, George wrote All Those Years Ago as a tribute to John. In a rare moment of post-Beatles collaboration, Paul and his wife Linda provided backing vocals with Ringo on drums. It was a brief truce prompted by grief, but it didn't magically erase a decade of resentment. Throughout the 80s, their relationship remained complicated. They would have dinner occasionally with Ringo, trying to rebuild bridges. George acknowledged this in 1988, saying, "You have to get to re-know each other again." But old habits died hard. The little brother, big brother dynamic still lingered. The real test came in the mid-90s with the massive Beatles anthology project. For the first time in over 2 decades, the 3 surviving Beatles would be working together again. The plan was to take 2 of John's old home demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love, and build new Beatles songs around them. The sessions were immediately fraught with old tensions. George was assertive, almost defiant. He insisted that his friend Jeff Lynne be brought in as a producer, a move Paul reluctantly agreed to. It was a power play, a clear statement that George would not be a supporting player this time. They argued just like they had in the old days. McCartney later admitted, "It could be dangerous just to all get in the studio. Could get nasty. You've got egos flying around." The anthology documentary itself is a fascinating look at their relationship. You see moments of genuine warmth and laughter, but you also see the tension. When Paul tells a story, the camera sometimes cuts to George, and you can see a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Yet despite the friction, the anthology project was ultimately a healing process. It forced them to confront their shared history, good and bad. It was a chance to reconnect as musicians and as men who had been through something extraordinary together. George offered a proverb that seemed to sum up their evolving relationship. "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." He then added, "I'm sure there's enough about me that pisses him off, but I think we have now grown old enough to realize that we're both pretty damn cute." The thought was slow and incomplete, but it was real. They were beginning to find their way back to a fragile, mature peace. The story of George and Paul is one of the most complex in music history. 2 friends who became brothers, then rivals, and finally something close to friends again. But it raises a question that fans have debated for decades. Was George justified in his decades of frustration, his feelings of being sidelined and creatively suffocated? Or was Paul, as the band's driving force, simply doing what he had to do to push the Beatles to be the greatest they could be, even if it meant stepping on his little brother's toes? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Was it a creative struggle or a personal grudge? There's no easy answer, and if you're enjoying this deep dive into music history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. In late 2001, George Harrison was dying. The cancer he had fought for years was finally winning. As he spent his final weeks, the feuds and fights of the past began to melt away, revealing the fundamental bond that lay beneath it all. Just a few weeks before George passed away, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr flew to New York for one last visit. They gathered for lunch, a final supper for the remaining Beatles. The mood wasn't somber. It was spirited. For hours they sat and reminisced, laughing about the old days. Dr. Gil Lederman, who was there, recalled, "There were tears, but George remained very much the man of dignity. He was a very happy man. This meeting meant so much to him." Paul's last visit with George, alone, was perhaps the most poignant chapter in their long, complicated story. It happened about 10 days before George's death. Paul sat with his friend for hours, and in a gesture that transcended decades of conflict, he held George's hand. "The last time I met him, he was very sick, and I held his hand for 4 hours," Paul would later recall. "As I was doing it, I was thinking, I've never held his hand before. Ever, this is not what two Liverpool fellas do, no matter how well you know each other." In that quiet room, the roles of big brother and little brother, of band leader and subordinate, finally dissolved. They were just George and Paul, two boys from Liverpool who had shared an impossible journey. "We joked about things, just amusing, nutty stuff. It was good. It was like we were dreaming," Paul said. "He was my little baby brother, almost, because I'd known him that long." In the end, after all the anger, the lawsuits, and the years of frosty silence, it came down to this simple, profound human connection. The love that had been there on the school bus in 1954 was still there in a New York hospital room in 2001. It had been buried under the weight of fame, ego, and misunderstanding, but it had never truly died. The story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney isn't a simple story of hate. It's a story of a deep brotherly bond that was tested to its absolute limit. George's anger was real, born from a legitimate struggle for respect within the biggest band in the world. He carried that frustration for most of his life, but in the final moments he let it go, and what was left was love. The quiet Beatle finally found his peace, and in doing so allowed his big brother to find his too.